Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of our new series of Fan History Project Zoom sessions. This time we get the pleasure of introducing, well, not introducing, but interviewing Juanita Coulson. There is no introduction really necessary. Juanita is known to all of you. So welcome, Juanita. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for asking me.
So Juanita, to start with, what got you started in science fiction fandom? You must have been reading this stuff.
Oh, yes.
What was your first fanish experience?
Well, not exactly fanish, but one of the earliest things I read, paperbacks were kind of scarce until much later, but a few were published during and right after the war. And at some point I picked up The Weird Shadow over Innsmouth. And I'm reading it, and I'm sorry I never got into Lovecraft or horror because my attitude was, okay, I get it, he's turning into a fish. Can he hurry up about it? This is pretty boring. But I also had discovered pulps and had to buy them in the local cigar store, which was the only place that carried them. So as a young teenage girl at 13 or 14, I'm going in, being glared at by tobacco smoking old men because I'm in there to pick up what was then Astounding or other Thrilling Wonder, all of the other pulp titles. I was starting to collect them. And at some point, my mother saw an ad for Other Worlds, which Ray Palmer was just starting on a shoestring, as usual, and got me I guess you would call it, founder's subscription to it. They were very sleazily printed, and there was absolutely no guarantee of what kind of quality you were going to get. You got everything from how on earth did anybody ever write this and expect to be paid for it, to Ray Bradbury's Way in the Middle of the Air, which had been turned down by every other publisher in the field because of its subject, but eventually made it into Martian Chronicles. And at some point, I got a magazine or a book from Dave Jenrette, who worked for a publisher in Pennsylvania. And against rules, he said, did you know there's a fan club in Indianapolis? I lived in Anderson, Indiana, which is about 40 miles northeast of Indianapolis. And the bus service was pretty good back then. Plus, my mother always was an ardent supporter of what I was doing. And she read them too. In fact, she was a major subscriber to both FNSF and Hitchcock's mystery magazine published by the same publisher. And she volunteered to drive me down after I first made contact with Leanne Tremper, who lived on Tuxedo Street in Indianapolis. And we had directions and we couldn't find Tuxedo Street. So there were phone booths of the Superman type. And I got out and dropped in my nickel, and I called the number which she had left me, spoke to her, and she said, oh, you just want to go up and turn right and go 3 blocks. And okay, good, we'll be there in a minute. And I got back in the car and turned to my mother and said, she's blonde. And I was right. I cannot tell you how I came to this snap judgment. But from that point on, I became good buddies with Leanne, who was thrilled to find another female who was reading science fiction and fantasy, because the majority of a very tiny club were male. And she had one other sort of girlfriend who would attend occasionally, but otherwise it was an all male club. And I could either take the bus down, which was my usual, and stay at Leanne's house. They had a rather large house and guest room. She had also contacted, and I'm not sure how this happened, Jean DeWeese, who lived in Rochester, Indiana.
Mhm.
which again is pretty far north. Gene knew how to drive, but he didn't have a car. And somewhere along this line, a fan, well, not yet a fan, a reader in Silver Lake, Indiana, received again an illegal message within a book or bottle from Dave Jenrett's publisher saying, did you know that there's a fan club in Indianapolis? And oh, by the way, there's another fan who would like to go down, and he's in Rochester. I see on the map it's very close to Silver Lake. Well, sort of close. And he doesn't have a car and he'd appreciate a ride. Buck's attitude was, okay, I'll give him a ride once. If I don't like the guy, I don't have to give him a ride again, since he was 5 years older than most of us and already had his own car because he'd been working since he was 18. And they eventually ended up writing 2 uncle books together, plus a great number of fanzine send-ups of all sorts of things. But that's how I got involved, and I continued to do that. And at the same time, I was, from 17 on, I was doing a part-time job in the library at Ball State College, where I was enrolled as a teacher candidate, and working in what was called teacher materials services. I was an art major in high school, so I'm doing illustrations for teachers to rent and or basically check out like a library, take use in their schools. The teacher was, the operator was not a teacher. She was a rather flaky artist enthusiast. And at one point she said, oh, you're doing all this wonderful science fiction stuff. And I did a cartoon series of the ending of Destination Moon. And this created great visibility among some of the people. Space, we're never going to go to space. What do you mean men on the moon? It's never going to happen. She was enthused and hurt by the criticism. And somewhere along the line, thanks to Leanne, I had found out there's going to be a World Convention of Science Fiction Authors in Chicago. Chicago's not that far from most of Indiana. And I thought, well, we'll never get there. I know Leanne's going. And my boss said, oh, this is precious. We must go. So we did. My mother, Miss Hoke, my employer, and me, in the first night, we stayed at a really strange hippie type apartment and attended, and I've seen pros whose work I'd written and seen all this other wonderful stuff. And by Saturday night, I have met Gene, but I haven't met Buck. He attended, but he attended solo. I'll go up and see what it's like, and if I don't like it, I can just drive away. My employer popped her hip when she stood up too fast and was convinced she had polio, which of course was terror at the time. And my poor mother was going to be drafted to drive her all the way back to Muncie, Indiana, and then pick up her car and drive to Anderson. And I went into pleading teenager mode. Can I? I can crash with Leanne. Please. And she said, I have $20. The train ticket is $6. And the banquet ticket is $5. And your room rent is going to be this for sharing with Leanne. That's all I can leave for you. And she did. And I moved in with Leanne and her friend Carol Childers. And that was my, shall I say, hook experience. I want more. I want a lot more.
So that would have been Chicon II in 1952.
1952. where I had $20 and the art auction, which then went just to the committee and the original publishers money. I sat in the front row and got to watch EMSHAs and other things being carried past, and I am sitting there with $20, which is already spoken for. So it was a proud and lonely thing to be a fan then. We were quite separated.
I can understand your temptations at that. At my first Worldcon, I attended an auction myself and could not buy anything.
No,
But
that
in
was
19,
usually the story.
so since you didn't meet Buck there, but you did meet other people, do you remember any of those that you met at the first Chicon?
Well, there was an interesting, we had three very young, younger than me, and I was still a teenager. And Ray Beam, who was the only adult in our small group from Indiana. And at the time, there was no rotation scheme for passing on the Worldcon, and of course, no NASFiC yet. And Philadelphia and St. Louis and San Francisco were both fan groups bidding for the next Worldcon. Got to remember, there were only 4 conventions in the country all year. So the Worldcon was precious, a big gathering wherever it was held. Well, we sat there and thought, gee, this is interesting, and maybe we'll vote for Philadelphia because we might have a chance of getting there if we hitchhike or something. And all of a sudden, Ray Beam is on stage with the 2 representatives from San Francisco and Philadelphia saying, I want to place in nomination the city of Indianapolis. Now understand, all the other fans there are teenagers. They do not have jobs. They are totally living with their parents. And Leanne screamed something to the effect, somebody killed that man. And suddenly we are surrounded by fans from San Francisco and Philadelphia, both pleading for us to throw our votes to them. If you want to imagine a fanish political convention with all the wheeling and dealing and et cetera, et cetera. And we don't want it to go away, get Gray off that stage. And he being practical because he didn't have money to go to San Francisco either. Once we came in second, which scared us. And he threw his votes to Philadelphia, of course, which meant Philadelphia got the Worldcon in '53. And San Francisco was so understandably soured by this that they started pushing for the rotation plan, which eventually was voted in. This is pre-Hugo's, pre-everything, which all came along later. And if you want to know how I met Buck.
Well, we can go right into that. It's one of my questions to get in here. So why don't you tell us about meeting Buck?
Well, this was before he got the note from Dave Jenrette telling him about Gene. Oh, we're fading out. I don't know where you went, but I can answer the question. Leanne, I would go down on the bus and stay with Leanne, and she would drive to wherever the meeting was going to be held. And she had parked the car and noticed this tall man walking along on the sidewalk holding one of her Espanoos meeting notices. And she screamed, which is not unusual for Leanne. And he later accused her of leaping out of the car and knocking him down, which did not happen. She said, it's right here, this place. I had dressed for the meeting in a new blouse, which turned out to have lost a top button. I am rather busty, and this was a rather sheer blouse. So I spent most of the evening trying to, not to obviously clutch the blouse together. Meanwhile, I am being studied very quietly all the time by a man with large brown eyes who and a very intense stare. He later explained this, well, I'm nearsighted. I didn't believe your hair. My hair was basically a brunette Dutch bob, which nobody had at the time, but it was easy to take care of. And Leanne later sympathized and said, I don't know what you do with that man with that ogle. Well, I later married him, so I guess that worked out okay.
Yes,
Once
you
he
figured
started
out-
bringing Gene down, and he met my best friend from college, and we ended up as a foursome. So for the rest of our lives.
Well, fandom has made many of us lifetime friends. You kept coming back to these, I guess.
When I could, yes.
Yeah.
Go. Sorry.
That's okay. Leanne Tremper had seemed to have a lot to do with that. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Okay, Leanne eventually became a grade school teacher in Indianapolis, but she gave me the bug on publishing because what she did was something called ISFA News. It was both an announcement of the next meeting will be held, but also several crude drawings and self-published local stories from the small group of fans that lived there. Well, when I was much younger, I had read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and been really captured by his being a printer's devil. My mother had given me a typewriter when I was 8, and I immediately set about, because it was the war, publishing a Junior Red Cross bulletin, which I forced on other people. And the printing bug never got away from me. And as I became an art major, the idea of why is the artwork so poor in ISFA News? And I wonder if I could do that. So following her lead, I figured out how to do memography by sneaking into the business offices and school at my college with the help of Bev Amers and getting a stencil at the bookstore, and we formed our own club. But we weren't the ISFA, which stood for the Indiana Science Fantasy Association. Ours was the Eastern Indiana Science Fiction Association, the Cool Club, because being of German heritage, I pronounce E-I-I, so it came out as ISFA. And my artwork was better from the start because that's what I wanted to do. But my mother was so afraid I was going to get expelled for sneaking into a college and using equipment that I wasn't supposed to be using, that she bought me a open drum, simple, basic type mimeograph from Sears. And if anybody had ever used an open drum, they know the first thing you do is buy black clothing. Everything you wear must be black because you're going to be messy by the time you get done. But over the years, I gradually learned how to cut stencils and particularly cut artwork, but I didn't have a lot of. Bev wrote some stuff for me. I wrote some stuff, and we had maybe a club of 5 people total. And we were also at the same time, Bev and I, involved in an early civil rights group that was so small that we were reported to the dean for being communists. And he looked at all 5 or 6 of us and said, I don't think there's enough of them to be a problem. So he did nothing. And we accomplished very little, but we tried. So I was busy on many fronts, a real troublemaker. So,
well, for several years, you were publishing, or the club was publishing the ISFA publication. How did you end up taking over that and turn
Well,
it into
the
your
club
own?
sort of gradually, people graduate in college. And even the one person who actually had graduated, he was a labor organizer of some sort. And he and his wife got transferred to somewhere else. And well, I wasn't going to give it up. So by that time, I had enough correspondence with enough fans. And that was the way you contacted other fans, by mail. And some magazines, like Other Worlds, actually had letter columns. And we immediately related this to LOC, Locke. I sent a letter of comment. Well, I could do that too. And I did it in ISFA and contacted other fans who started submitting articles and so forth. And eventually, this tall man with the brown eyes and I decided, well, we might as well get married. We've been going around together all this time. And he and Jean, by this time, had been writing articles for me. And after we got married, Buck and I both were big fans of folk music. And we decided, well, it's not ISFA anymore. There isn't any club. It needs a new name. And at the time, there were no fanzines, and believe it or not, with a Y as a beginning. And we both thought the folk song look away over yonders, which abbreviated in mountain talk to Yandro. And that's the right name because we both love folk music. And that from that point on, and because I so loved doing the artwork, and I was getting more and more submissions of artwork, and I don't know whether this fan story is any good or not. And I really hate to hurt people's feelings. So I told Buck, from now on, you're the publisher editor. You write the rejection letters. I'm the publisher. I'm the printer. And I took pride in making it as typo-free and as art decorated as possible. And from that point on, we put it out almost every month, sort of like putting out milk bottles or something for delivery.
So you were the nice guy publisher, and Buck lived up to his reputation of being the curmudgeon editor.
Well, I had originally in ISFA, I believe, started a little art editorial I called Ramblings, which is pretty much a description of what it was all about. So he decided his was not going to be Ramblings, it's going to be Rumblings. And he was really a softie about a lot of things. So, but they balanced each other.
Well, in my correspondence with him, he seemed to enjoy sometimes doing the rumbling anyway.
Yes.
But he was always pretty kind-hearted with my very poor correspondence. Okay. When you think back on it, you had a chance and you got involved very quickly, first in a Worldcon, then with a club and publications. Were there any particular fans or professionals who you really wanted to meet and had a chance to through your fanish activities?
Well, fairly early on, you are in correspondence, but you people didn't travel a lot then. We couldn't afford it. And the airplane flight was expensive. It's only for rich people. One of the major focusing points was MidwestCon, which had been held for quite some time in Ohio.
Right.
The first one I went to, Leanne and I went on the bus with Ray Beam, and by that time, there was a Northern Indiana fan from a town called Culver, which was totally integrated in the time. It was very unusual. And the young fan, beautiful young woman named Bev Bowles. And she didn't have transportation. Buck was the only one with a car. So he, Jean, and Bev Bowles were going to come, and we were all going to rendezvous in Indian Lake, where MidwestCon was. And Leanne and I went on the bus, and we got our room, and I kept asking all day, where are they? Where are they? Has anybody seen them? They should have been. I'm starting to worry about wrecks and broken bodies by the side of the road sort of thing. It was only probably at 10 o'clock at night on Saturday that I got a phone call from Gene, who had gone into Rochester because his house did not have a phone, and told me they had been denied a room. They came in and says, "So the guys will share a room, and this young lady needs her own room." And they said, "Well, you can have a room, she can't." And they said, "Well, we'll sleep in the car and you can give our room to her." At which point nobody had a room. And a number of fans had witnessed this exchange with the hotel staff. None of them told me, which I resented very much later on. Fortunately for any attendance at a future MidwestCon, it moved to Cincinnati, which was a lot more open. But the next Worldcon was in Philadelphia, and Bev went with us.
Mm-hmm.
Not Bev Amers, my best friend, because she couldn't afford to. But I had a beginner's license. Buck had a new black four-door stripped model Ford and a bench seat. I had my beginner's license. He drove, Gene drove. We had a friend who later worked for NASA and doing weather things that he couldn't tell us what he was doing, who was 6'4", 6'5" actually. And they picked him up in Ypsilanti, and he said, "Oh, fellas, I don't drive." So our friend Bob Briney spent the entire trip with Bev Bowles, I, and her friend, and the three guys, both of whom were fairly tall, and then Briney. And he would try to wait and see who was going to drive on the Turnpike, Pennsylvania Turnpike. And at the last minute, it would change. And he would get in the passenger seat when a woman was driving, at which point the bench seat went all the way forward, and he rode the next 100 or so miles with his chin on his knees. But when we got to Philadelphia, we were worried that maybe the MidwestCon was going to do a repeat. And as soon as we walked in, we saw a huge sign saying "Welcome Urban League." So we decided we were probably going to be okay. And Briney came in with his suitcase, at which point Harlan Ellison rushed over and hugged him around the waist and said, "Oh, my old pal Briney." They had known each other for a while, and Briney looked as though he really wanted to be somewhere else and not in public display during this effusive welcome from a very short. I've known Harlan since we were both 17. I was in the registration line at Chicago, and I looked over and I see a very crippled man hanging to a doorknob talking to Robert Heinlein and Block. That was Ray Palmer, who had multiple physical problems. And then this young man about my height, carrying a stack of fanzines, rushed over and said, "You want to buy a copy of my fanzine?" And most people said, "No, I'm waiting to register," at which point he would scream, "You creep," at them and go to the next person. That was my meeting with Harlan. And things got even more interesting later on.
Well, Harlan always was one to help keep things interesting. How did he make things interesting for you?
We went to, after Indian Lake, we transferred to Bell Fountain, Ohio, which was the home of one of the committee members, Doc Barrett. And this is where the infamous door incident happened, of many interpretations. This hotel, shall I say, dated to early 1800s. There were beds and there was a laundry facility. There was no restroom in your room. There was down the hall, there was one room had a shower and a facility and a hook on the door. And there was always a line because while the laundry tub might have been useful for the males, it wasn't too convenient for the females who were, unfortunately, there weren't very many of us. And at one point, Harlan apparently was dropping water bag balloons out the window on the front street. And Jim Harmon, who later became quite famous for doing comic books and movies, etc., was walking underneath. And he took umbrage, it came rushing up. There were many, many, many fantasy stories about Harlan being dragged out hanging onto the phone. Well, there were no phones in these rooms, trust me. And I later talked to Mary Southworth, who was the woman in the room about whom nothing was going on. And they called out as one very noisy young Indiana fan said the whole lousy police force, which consisted of 2 cops. And fortunately, Leanne said, "Oh, he's so cute, I'll take his picture." So the one younger cop posed and was quite deflected from doing what he probably wanted to do to the noisy Indiana fan. Later that evening, we had open parties, in fact, that you sat around in your room with the door open and cruised up and down, talking to people. And Jim Harmon came by. Well, Harlan came by first, saying, "Oh, he regretted it. Sorry. Well, we're going to take up a collection to pay for the door." Okay, chip in $1. And a little later, an Ohio friend who we knew came by with Jim Harmon and had tried to disguise Jim wearing his coat. Well, our friend was probably 90 pounds sopping wet. Jim Harmon was not. So the coat disguised about a third of him, the third that would actually fit. And he took up a collection. And the next year we met at Bellefontaine for MidwestCon at the end of May. And the door had been plywooded. And there was a brand new AV downstairs so they could show films for the local, I don't know, scout club or something. And we decided we knew where our donations had gone. So it was
Okay.
the sort of place where you caught a bat in the lobby and all the fans had to persuade the owner not to kill it because they eat insects and take it outside and release it. He was puzzled by us.
Well, fans have puzzled a lot of people over the years,
Yes.
but it sounds like you were there for some of the exciting Midwest cons.
Well, you've got to remember we couldn't make it to California and we couldn't make it to New York for Lunicon or whatever, but we could make it usually as far as Cincinnati or in earlier cases to Indian Lake and then Bellefontaine.
Mm-hmm.
We moved out of Bellefontaine to Cincinnati after Doc Barrett complained about the door incident and all the hoo-ha it had caused because, fellas, I have a practice here. My customers are the local citizens and they're not happy right now with these strange people who are invading and doing things to this hotel. So we've ended up at the Hotel What's Its Name in Cincinnati, actually in Redding, which is a suburb of Cincinnati.
Well, that's actually an interesting little bit of background about not only why it moved, but the fact that part of the reason it moved was because Doc Barrett had to keep his practice going. Okay, you had been by that time doing quite a few fanzines. You were publishing, I guess, monthly.
Yandro, yeah.
And you were getting not just Jean Delis, but you were getting all kinds of people writing. How did you get so many different contributors? How
Well,
did you
you've got to remember at the time, almost everything was done by mail.
right?
We were great. You had terrific letter writers. Robert Bloch once explained he only responded, unless it was an actual contribution, which he occasionally gave us, with postcards, because you couldn't write too much. And he could get done with it very quickly, so he could take care of a lot of his correspondence very quickly with a pile of postcards. But some fans wrote letters at great length, and Buck would go through them and basically edit, okay, this part is strictly personal, or this part pertains to something that we don't care about. So we build up a letter column, which feeds itself, because people want to respond to what somebody, a pro or a fan, wrote in the last issue of Yandro. And since we were regular, we were publishing every month. They knew it was going to be published. There were attempts at weekly fanzines, mostly little newsletters. Some of them lasted longer than I would have anticipated, because I knew how much it took to publish and get it all put together and get it sorted by however many districts of mail it was going to, and get it sorted and get it stamped and get it down to the post office and get it off. But Robert Bloch once told us that he also attended VoucherCons and other gatherings of mystery writers, because he was quite active at the time. I don't think he'd written Psycho yet, but he was getting up there. And he said the other authors at the mystery envied him, because they were on a stage totally separate, and their fans are out there and would only come to book signings or something. Whereas in science fiction fandom, everybody was a fan, including the pros. I remember being in the one meeting room they had. It was a hospitality meeting, whatever you want to call it, just one room. We called it the NASFiC because it was decorated with paintings of fish. And somebody wanted to know who everybody was. There were probably a total of 8 to 10 people there, and early on Sunday morning. And I was able to tell them who everyone was, including Doc Smith, who attended with his wife. And one of the other fans said, I couldn't remember all those names. And I said, when you put out a fanzine, you get used to this face goes with that name, especially after you've met them. And that was the place you met them, because at the rare convention, you looked forward. Well, I can't get to San Francisco, or I can't get to Florida, or I can't get to New Orleans or whatever, but I can get to Midwestcon. There's a bus. I can take a bus to. And you do remember the trains ran back then, which meant Asimov occasionally attended Midwestcons, because passenger service ran from his East Coast area to the Cincinnati area. And at least a number of times we had banquets. If there was a restaurant close to the hotel, we would meet there. And once it was very bright and everybody sat around the pool all day talking. And by the evening, everybody looked like a lobster. Everybody from Isaac Asimov to Robert Bloch to Bob Tucker. Tucker was the permanent MC at Midwestcons. He always showed up. And when we had 2-car caravan to get out to a buffet to hold our banquets, he would introduce everybody. And at some of the later ones, he always overlooked the editor of Astounding for a short time, who wrote wonderful vampire stories. Oh, I blacked on his name. And as people would start pointing, here at this table, he's a very small man, very modest. And Tucker would go into his, oh, I'm so sorry. each time, and it became a shtick. Tucker introduced a lot of shticks, including with his Jim Beam. You were not supposed to, you were supposed to basically inhale a drop until we got all the way around the circle, and then do the smooth routine, which came from him being a movie projectionist. There is a scene in The Great Ziegfeld, a later one, where Red Buttons has a skit, what it will be like when television arrives, and demonstrating a commercial salesman having to do the commercial cuts and demonstrate Guzzler's chin at each thing by actually drinking some. And it's very, you want to go out and buy it, it's smooth. And Tucker said he had to watch that movie for 2 weeks. And the only part he enjoyed was Red Skelton's routine, so he adopted it. And everybody had to smooth after that with Tucker. Whether you drank any or not, you weren't supposed to, actually.
And then and kept it going for decades.
Decades. Our son has one signature, says Bob Tucker, on one of Tucker's books, because there was a big milling at a later World Convention. He had grown up in fandom and Tucker knew him. And they were passing out what we called used car salesman hats to all the pros. And they called them up on stage to be introduced. Well, he saw a friend he wanted to talk to. So he put the hat on my son's head. Our son was 10. And somebody looking for a Bob Tucker autograph asked for him. So he signed it and wonders if the guy ever tried to sell it. So, but.
Well, at least he wasn't charged with forgery.
No, if you want a signature, I'll sign it for you.
I'm going to ask you to go off of fandom for a moment, but back into 50s period politics.
Oh, yes. You learned this from Canada, did you? I first revealed this up there, so at one of the Canadian Filk cons.
Well, you were mentioning a number of things that might have been political in a few moments ago, but how did your area of fandom react to the many things such as McCarthyism that were going on during that period?
About the way they would have reacted now. We were appalled. We were also appalled for a lot of people in other fields whose work we enjoyed, actors, writers, who were being accused. In some cases, possibly validly, but that was in the 30s or 40s, and there were definite problems having grown up in the 30s and 40s. I understand why some people say there's got to be a better way to do this. But I personally ran into it headlong because when I went to, I wanted to be a UN translator. And I thought this would be wonderful. I took foreign languages in high school along with my art career. But once I figured out there were no women cartoonists at the time, in the 1940s, well, that idea probably, okay, career day, all these tables and all these recruiters. I went to a rather large high school of 96 faculty. And I thought, well, how about becoming a UN translator? Well, that didn't seem, but there was somebody there from United Fruit. Oh, yes, we will train you. And we'll probably send you to Belize, but possibly to one of our Spanish speaking. And okay, I've had Spanish. And they said the tuition is $400 a semester for a 2-year course. It might as well have been $40,000 at the income level my mother had. Right next to it was a table from Ball State Teachers College. This is 1950. They're looking for at the baby boom. Would you like to be a teacher? We'll make you really good scholarship. Well, Okay, so I ended up signing up to get an art minor and become an elementary teacher because I had fallen deeply into love with words thanks to my first and second grade teachers. And I thought to be one of them, I would be great. So I ended up in Huntington, Indiana, which Buck was working in North Manchester at the bookbindery. Okay, it's like 20 miles commute one way. We can do this. We will set up house in Huntington and he can commute. And I had gotten an invitation to come back the next year. I had gotten comments at my school because I used their ditto machine to print a little newspaper for my second grade class every week, trying to work my way through the entire class by mentioning every child's name. Judy made 100 on spelling, and Tommy had a birthday, this sort of thing. And nobody had done this before, so this was unusual. And we kept publishing Yandro, of course, taking it down to the post office. And in a small town, you are noticed, whatever you do. And I thought, maybe I can get a job teaching in North Manchester, and then Buck wouldn't have to commute. We could find a small apartment or something, and this would work out. So I at least sent an inquiry. And the next thing I know, I was called out of class and taken downtown to meet the school board, which kept questioning me on my lifestyle, basically. And I kept asking, what do you object to about the magazine? And Yandro, I will say, of the era was squeaky clean. And well, it's different. That was basically what it all boiled down to. I had done things that were not expected. I were out of the ordinary, even if I was trying to do them to help the children. I brought in some of my own children's books to assist because I couldn't get much cooperation out of the, well, it's a low economic area. We can't expect much out of those children. Well, I didn't like that attitude very well, so I enriched their out of my own pocket. And the next thing I know, I do not have a job in Huntington. And when I went up to go interview at North Manchester school system, I was basically told, well, you got great references and everything here, but we're not too sure about this. And I quote exactly, please do not put me down for it. We think there's a in the woodpile. This is their way of saying McCarthy wouldn't approve of you. And this was years after he was launching the worst of his accusations. So it doesn't die away immediately. It leaves its mark. I am fearful right now, but I probably won't live long enough to see how it all comes out. But we'll find out, won't we?
Well, those of us who lived through it all.
We can be a target because we're doing something different.
Well, do you think that you had a political bent or
Off
in
job? Yes, not on the job.
What about in Yandro?
We printed a lot of stuff that was both, but fandom in general has always been pretty liberal, even back then. And they were not happy with McCarthy, but that's the way it was. Can't fight City Hall, etc.
Well,
so I became a bookbinder. I worked at a bookbindery, collating.
Quite a bit different.
Its advantages because major universities would send works in to be rebound. And on my lunch break, I could read them. And then my fellow workers would say, why are you reading that? It's about Greek statuary. They're all pictures of nude people. I said, they're statues. It's the human anatomy, you know, it really exists, etc. But it was a very suppressed, not to mention obsessed era. So fandom was lonely.
Well, you can tell that in a lot of the publications that there were often a lot of young men who were a bit frustrated as well with the pictures and stuff that were in. You were one of the few, relatively few women who were regularly publishing, working on a fanzine. I mean,
Marianne had one. A lady named Mary Ann Cox did. Leanne did, etc., etc. We were even lonelier as Proud and Lonely. Because I would say the percentage of females was probably at most 15 to 20%, most of it 15. And we were not always welcomed at conventions by what had up until that point been a boys' club. A lot of the men were either bachelors or they were married men escaping for a vacation from family life. And their attitude was, we were there to catch a husband. And I had to explain again and again, I have no interest in you. I want to read science fiction. And I'm here to buy your books or whatever.
Well, you were probably the most prominent femme fan after Lee Hoffman from the earlier portion in the 50s with her quandary and the stories that went about her introduction to Tucker and at the Chicon in 52.
No, drop the towel, right?
Yes, but can you tell me, is there any particular, and this doesn't have to be in the 50s or any particular point, what you found most interesting that you published or things that are still memorable that you published in Yandro?
Well, I remember when I enjoyed the most. At one of the, I think it was Cleveland, Sputnik had just gone up. And maybe a few of the very earliest Russian programs. So there was a huge interest in fandom. Finally, we're getting spaceships, released off the planet. And during a major meeting of introducing the pros, and this is a program item, etc., one of the committees said, well, we have Mr. Robert Abernathy, who did a few publications at the time, and he is going to give us a report on the latest Russian space prize. Oh, big interest. Well, he read it from the podium in Russian.
In Russian.
In Russian. And I rushed over to our friend Bob Briney, who I knew was intimate with a great number of foreign languages because of his work in mathematics, which he was translating and putting into the use of NASA and early science programs. And I said, could you do that, those characters? Can you get that from Abernathy? And he did, as a friendly gesture. And I very laboriously recorded that on stencil, copying all the Russian, the Cyrillic characters very carefully, and put it on the second page in Yandro. I said, and now on the next page, Robert Abernathy's address on space progress of Russians. I really enjoyed doing that. But we got poetry from Robert Bloch. We got poetry, a lot of poetry from Elsbreg de Camp, who wrote a great deal. And we were quite gratified. Later on, he had a slim volume, many slim volumes of poetry because he was very prolific, published. And on the copyright page, 90% of it was published originally in Yandro. And he always said, make 6 copies, 1 for me and 5, and I will take care of the publication, the copyright. He said, put this C, surrounded C, copyright Elsbreg de Camp, and send me the extra copies, and I'll take care of all the rest. So we had the privilege. Later on in Filk, I was able he had one wonderful thing on the progress of war and how they're all dead and this river still flows. And I wanted to set it to music, and it took me a very long time to do so. And I finally got a second guitar, which I was able to do a special tuning and set it. We were at a convention in Oklahoma many years later, and I so noticed Mr. DeCamp and his wife at breakfast. They had finished. They were down to their coffee, so I thought it would not be impolite to Mr. DeCamp. I wanted you to know I asked you at the time I published it, if I ever find music for that, would it be okay if I set it to music? He said, sure, as long as you give me credit for it. And they immediately started reciting it exactly. And I thought, this man has written thousands of poems, and he remembers all of them. So we were proud of publishing things from prose. Or Roger Ebert sent us a piece of fiction, sort of, about one hippie sort of thing. It was an early piece of fiction of basically describing a dream sequence, but maybe it was real. He also sent a love letter to one of our fellow editors at the time, except she's already married. So this was before he and Siskel became household names reviewing movies.
Yes, it would be. He sort of gave up fandom at that when he started doing the movie reviews.
Well, we do have a photo of him at an early Midwest con wearing a lampshade over his head. And Tucker went around apologizing. He said, I didn't know the guy didn't drink. I just gave him one beer. And he turned into a monster. So,
Oh, maybe I should try to get that photo from you sometime. So we can, to continue the filking, though, a long time ago, back in the 70s, you wrote an article for me about the history of filking. But can you
one viewpoint?
Sure.
I mean, as I said, there are many of the early days of people who want to say they invented it. And I'm okay with that, because I believe in spontaneous generation. And I'm sure in a way we all did, because we were a proud and lonely group too within fandom.
Well, can you tell us how you started adapting material for music?
Well,
some of your
I had started piano when I was 3. My mother was very encouraging. My father had a wonderful bass. He was a basso profundo of the deepest range, and he sang in community chorus despite the fact that he couldn't read music. I at least had piano lessons, but I never learned to read vocal music. But thanks to that inheritance, all his family, they're musically, they have good ear. Hum a few bars and I'll sing with you, sort of. That we can't claim any credit for it, it's just there. And Buck, of course, was because lyrics are a problem for me sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. And he had a natural gift for lyrics, so I'm suddenly pouncing on somebody who's writing Kipling-esque poetry that I can adapt. And when I was walking to and fro, I did not live on campus. I had about a 6-block walk. I would work on both singing and the lyrics until I perfected something called chess. But I had no way to perform it. And it was there. But other things, and I would adapt other people's if I found it. There were attempts in the 30s, actually. I think I mentioned this. I found one fanzine that had been published in the late 30s, and it had a very technocratic theme, which of course is very big in the late 30s.
Right.
But I had always written some kinds of music. when I was in college, I had already met Bev. I was probably at most a sophomore. They actually had an old-fashioned 78 recording machine with the shavings and the whole bit. And as a Christmas present, I went and recorded an album for my mother. One side was some folk song, and the other side was Man Had a Planet, Man Had a Bomb. He put the two together, and now both of them are gone, basically on that theme. And Buck said, oh, well, I have extra album covers that I don't, this one got broken, so I will fix that. You can draw pictures, which I did, with a diagonal slash, one for the super of the man bidding goodbye before he goes off to the stars, and the other one of the man bidding goodbye before he goes off to the Crusades. And my mother eventually, oh, well, it's recording, so she was thrilled. And it now should be with Harold's. I donated it, among other things, to the Filk, basically the Filk Foundation. They're doing their own history making, collecting as much as they can. Buck had made a lot of cassettes of Filks down through the years for personal use only, and labeled all the numbers. And I donated those because who plays cassettes? Techies. They can transfer it.
I sure can. And that will be a wonderful historical archive.
But I have no difficulty pouncing on somebody else's wonderful stuff. Most majority, I don't think a lot of people realize this, of my stuff has been covers. I've been a ham since I was too young to remember it. I was told, I was put up on a tavern table when I was 3 and told to sing for the guys, sing and dance for the guys. And I did, and they gave me candy. And I thought that's a pretty good gig. So I have no stage fright at all. And I will, okay, make people laugh. I can make people laugh. And I would hear somebody, some early filker do something and say, I can do that. And I can really ham it up. And in the early days of Filk, as I explained, it was me and some pretty young Joan Baez imitator. And we'd rest each other. Her fingers are recuperating while my fingers are recuperating while she sings, and vice versa. She's doing beautiful stuff. I am most of the time, 90% of the time, doing funny stuff. That's good. Keeps them there. She brings in the male flies.
Well, I don't think you have a guitar with you, but
No.
would you sing us a song that you
Yeah. Let's see if I can find it fairly quickly here.
something you like?
No, this is historical too. In a way, it all ties in. And I think I can almost do it from memory. When in publishing, and I was fascinated with publishing and actually making everything look right. Art near corners, da, 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 da. And occasionally you end up with what's called a widow. It's blank space. I had about half a page. I said, Buck, I got a blank page, write me a verse. So he dashed off something that worked fine. And when filking started taking off, I said, I think I can set that to music. And for whatever reason, it really caught the imagination of a lot of other the beginnings of Filk. It was simply called Star Drive.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, Buck named it Memorandum.
Right.
The Star Drive was discovered on a planet of Centaurus by a race which built its cities when the Earth was flaming gas. They swept out through the starlings and the dawning of creation, and 1 billion years of empire came to pass. I really need to find the lyrics after all these years. Sorry. I've had as Joe knows, I had a bit of a medical crisis not yesterday, actually, Thursday night. And I wasn't sure I was, come on, where are you? There. Actually, I'm sorry, it's memorandum is the first takeoff. The original title was Reminder. You've heard the first verse. Their successors were a race of mighty insects from Orion. They didn't have the star drive, but they didn't ever die. They smashed a dying empire and they settled down to rule it. And another billion years or so went by. The insects were supplanted when the drive was rediscovered. They couldn't halt rebellion when they couldn't catch their foes. And the Zen became the rulers. They were reptiles from Arcturus, and they worshipped the black swamps from which they rose. But the Zen are few in number, and the universe is mighty, and they felt their grasp on power start to slip between their claws. Others fought for domination, and the universe was chaos, and on the earth a creature shaped it with its paws. Now the first ones are forgotten, the insects but a memory. The creature called man stands upon the threshold of his fame. But remember, puny earthling, there were others here before you, and still others who will follow in your flame. And it spawned, I don't know how many takeoffs by other fans, because it's so simple.
And that was Buck's filler.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
It fit perfectly. He brought it in. I said, yeah, just right. That fills the top of that page, and I've got this at the bottom. And away we went. And it's only later when filking started taking off that I said, oh, I've already got this.